The clouds hung low over Pine Creek as Greg Winters stepped off the bus. 15 years had passed since he'd last set foot in the town where he grew up. Nothing much had changed. The same weathered storefronts lined Main Street, the same old clock tower still chimed every hour, and the same misty hills surrounded everything like protective arms. But Greg wasn't here for nostalgia. He was here to bury his sister. The phone call had come 3 days ago. Lydia, his only sister, gone at 38. The doctor on the phone had mentioned cancer, a battle fought quietly over months. Greg had stood in his apartment 200 miles away, listening to a stranger explain how his sister had died without him knowing she was even sick. "She didn't want to worry you," the doctor had said, his voice soft with something that might have been accusation. Greg pulled his worn duffel bag higher on his shoulder and began walking. He didn't need directions. Even after all these years, his feet remembered the way to his childhood home. The sidewalk was cracked in all the same places, tree roots pushing up through concrete like stubborn memories refusing to stay buried. Mrs. Chen was watering flowers outside her gift shop. Her hand froze mid-pour when she spotted him. "Greg, is that you?" He nodded, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I heard about Lydia." Mrs. Chen set down her watering can. "We all tried to help, you know. Brought food, drove her, to appointments when she could still go." The unspoken question hung in the air. "Where were you?" "I didn't know," Greg said simply. "She never told me." Mrs. Chen's expression softened. "That sounds like Lydia. Never wanted to be a burden to anyone." Greg continued walking, feeling the weight of eyes from shop windows and passing cars. In small towns, news traveled faster than people did. By now, everyone would know the prodigal brother had returned. The house at the end of Maple Lane looked smaller than he remembered. The blue paint had faded to a tired gray, and the front garden Lydia had always been so proud of was overrun with weeds. A single pot of geraniums stood defiantly bright on the porch steps. Greg stood at the gate, key in hand, unable to move forward. The last time he'd been here, there had been shouting, tears, doors slamming. Their father's funeral had brought all the old family wounds to the surface. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. He'd left that night, promising himself he'd never return, and he hadn't. Not when their mother passed 3 years later, not for holidays or birthdays. Just Christmas cards and occasional short phone calls that never went beneath the surface of things. "Didn't think I'd see you here." Greg turned to find a man about his age leaning against a pickup truck. It took him a moment to recognize his childhood friend. "Tom." Greg nodded. "Been a while." 15 years, 2 months. Tom didn't smile. "But who's counting?" The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken history. "You're staying at the house?" Tom finally asked. "Just until after the funeral. Then I'll get everything sorted and head back." Tom shook his head slightly. "Typical. Some things never change." He pushed off from his truck. "Funeral's tomorrow at 2. Sullivan's funeral home. Lydia arranged everything herself, down to the last detail." That sounded like his sister. Organized, independent, handling everything on her own. Even her own funeral. Was she in pain? Greg asked, the question he'd been afraid to voice since he got the call. Something flickered across Tom's face. "You should have been here, man." With that, he got into his truck and drove away, leaving Greg alone with the key to a house full of memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and something else, the faint antiseptic smell of illness. Greg moved through the room slowly, taking in the familiar and the changed. The old family photos still hung in the hallway, including one of him and Lydia as teenagers, arms around each other, laughing at some forgotten joke. In the kitchen, a calendar hung on the wall, days marked with cryptic notations. Doctor appointments, he guessed. The last marked date was circled in red, exactly 1 week ago. Beneath it, in Lydia's neat handwriting, final arrangements. She had known she was dying and had planned everything, including apparently not telling her only brother. Greg sat heavily at the kitchen table, the same one they'd eaten at as children. A stack of mail sat neatly arranged at one corner. On top was a cream-colored envelope addressed to him in Lydia's handwriting. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. "Greg," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then you've come home and I'm gone. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I wanted to call so many times, but I couldn't bear to be another sad story in your life. You always needed to get away from this town, from the weight of family obligation. I understood that even when it hurt." Greg had to stop reading, his vision blurring. He wiped his eyes and continued. "There are things I need to tell you, but not in this letter. After the funeral, go to the old boathouse at the lake. The key is in the cookie jar, the one shaped like a cat that Mom always hated. You'll find what you need there." The letter ended simply. "I forgive you for leaving. I hope someday you'll forgive yourself. Love always, Lydia." Greg set the letter down, feeling the weight of his sister's words. The cookie jar sat on a shelf above the sink, a garish ceramic cat that their mother had indeed detested but kept, because it had been a gift from Aunt June. Inside was a small brass key with a tag attached, Boathouse. What was so important that Lydia couldn't write it in her letter? What was waiting for him at the old boathouse where they'd spent summers as kids? The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. On the porch stood a woman with graying hair pulled back, in a practical bun. "Mrs. Wilson?" Greg recognized his former high school English teacher. "Hello, Greg. I brought some food." She held out a covered dish. "I imagine cooking is the last thing on your mind right now." He accepted the dish, oddly touched by the gesture. "Thank you. Would you like to come in?" She shook her head. "Not today, but I wanted you to know that your sister was loved here. She helped a lot of people." "I'm learning that," Greg said quietly. After Mrs. Wilson left, more visitors came. Old neighbors, Lydia's co-workers from the library, people Greg barely remembered or had never met. Each brought food and stories about his sister. How she'd started a literacy program for kids, how she'd fought to save the historic buildings downtown, how she'd delivered books to elderly residents who couldn't leave their homes. With each story, the knot in Greg's chest tightened. Who was this woman they were describing? He'd known his sister as the quiet bookworm, the responsible one who stayed behind. He hadn't realized she'd become the heart of the community. By evening, the kitchen counter was filled with casseroles and pies, and Greg's head was spinning with revelations about the sister he thought he knew. As the sun set, he found himself drawn to Lydia's bedroom. He hesitated at the door, feeling like an intruder, before stepping inside. The room was neat and sparse, a single bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser, and a small desk by the window. On the desk sat a framed photograph he'd never seen before. Lydia, looking thin but smiling, stood beside an elderly man Greg didn't recognize. They were in front of what appeared to be a cabin, and the man had his hand protectively on Lydia's shoulder. Greg picked up the frame, studying the stranger's face. Who was this man, and why did he have a place of honor on Lydia's desk? As he set the photo down, he noticed a business card tucked into the frame's edge. Dr. Howard Reed, Oncology. On the back was handwritten, "If anything happens, call Greg. He needs to know about the arrangement." What arrangement? And why would Lydia's doctor have instructions to call him? A soft knock at the front door pulled Greg from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found an elderly man standing on the porch, the same man from the photograph. "You must be Greg," the man said, his voice gravelly with age. "I'm Howard Reed. I was your sister's doctor." Greg nodded, suddenly understanding. "You called me about Lydia." "Yes." Dr. Reed glanced past Greg into the house. "May I come in? There are things we need to discuss before tomorrow." "The funeral," Greg said. Dr. Reed's expression was unreadable in the porch light. "Yes, the funeral. Lydia was very specific about certain arrangements." As Greg stepped aside to let the doctor enter, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his sister's passing than a tragic battle with cancer. The key to the boathouse weighed heavy in his pocket, and Lydia's letters seemed to burn in his mind. What was it his sister had wanted him to know? What secret was waiting at the lake? And why did he have the unsettling feeling that tomorrow they wouldn't just be burying his sister, but something else entirely. The morning of Lydia's funeral arrived with a gentle rain that seemed fitting for the occasion. Greg stood at the kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, watching droplets race down the glass. He hadn't slept much. His conversation with Dr. Reed the night before had left him with more questions than answers. Lydia was very specific about the funeral arrangements Dr. Reed had explained, settling into the worn armchair in the living room. Closed casket, no viewing, no embalming. That seems unusual, Greg had said. Dr. Reed's weathered face had remained carefully neutral. Your sister valued her privacy even in death. There was something the old doctor wasn't saying. Greg could feel it hanging in the air between them. But before he could press further, Dr. Reed had stood up. Get some rest, son. Tomorrow will be difficult enough. Then he'd added, almost as an afterthought, have you been to the boathouse yet? Greg had shaken his head. Perhaps wait until after the funeral, Dr. Reed had advised. Some things are better understood in the right sequence. Now, as Greg dressed in the only dark suit he owned, those cryptic words echoed in his mind. What sequence? What was he supposed to understand? The funeral home was modest, tucked between a hardware store and a small park. By the time Greg arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. He hadn't expected so many people to come. Inside, the chapel was filled with flowers, not formal arrangements, but wildflowers and garden blooms, the kind Lydia had always preferred. At the front stood a simple wooden casket, closed as requested, with a spray of lilies on top. Greg paused in the doorway, suddenly overwhelmed. These people had known his sister in ways he hadn't. They had been there during her illness while he had been absent. What right did he have to stand at the front as her only family? A hand touched his elbow. You came. She hoped you would. He turned to find a woman about Lydia's age, with kind eyes and hair streaked with early gray. I'm Beth, she said. Lydia and I worked together at the library. She was my best friend. Best friend. Another thing Greg hadn't known about his sister's life. Thank you for being there for her, he managed to say. Beth's eyes filled with tears. She was there for all of us, in so many ways. She hesitated. Has Dr. Reed spoken with you? Greg nodded. Briefly, last night. Good. Beth seemed relieved. Listen, after this is over, a few of us are gathering at the lake house. Nothing formal, just people who loved Lydia. You should come. The lake house. Near the boathouse. Greg felt a chill that had nothing to do with the funeral home's air conditioning. I'll try, he said. The service was simple and moving. People stood to share memories of Lydia, her quiet determination, her unexpected humor, her fierce loyalty. Greg learned that his sister had started a foundation to help local children with medical expenses, that she'd fought against a development project that would have destroyed the town's historic district, that she'd been writing a history of Pine Creek that remained unfinished. When it was Greg's turn to speak, he found himself at a loss. What could he say about a sister he'd barely spoken to in 15 years? But as he stood before the crowd, words came, not about the woman they knew, but about the girl he had known. The sister who had taught him to ride a bike, who had defended him against bullies, who had slipped notes under his door when their parents were fighting. Lydia always protected people, he concluded, his voice rough with emotion. Even when they didn't know they needed protecting. Even when they didn't deserve it. He returned to his seat, aware of the weight of eyes upon him. Some sympathetic, some curious, some openly hostile. He was the brother who had abandoned her after all. After the service, as people filed out toward the cemetery for the burial, Greg felt a tug on his sleeve. It was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with serious eyes and a cowlick that refused to stay down. Are you really Miss Lydia's brother? The boy asked. Greg nodded, surprised. She told me about you. Said you were brave 'cause you left to follow your dreams. The boy thrust out his hand. I'm Danny. Miss Lydia was helping me with my science project before she got too sick. Greg shook the small hand, unexpectedly touched. What was your project about? Water testing. We were checking the lake and the creek. Danny lowered his voice. Miss Lydia said it was important, but we had to be secret scientists about it. Before Greg could ask what that meant, a woman called Danny's name, and the boy ran off with a quick wave. The graveside service was brief. The casket lowered into the ground with a finality that made Greg's chest tighten. As people began to drift away, Dr. Reed appeared at his side. "Will you be going to the lake house?" the doctor asked quietly. Greg nodded. "Beth invited me." "Good. I'll see you there." Dr. Reed paused. "Did you bring the key?" Greg patted his pocket, where the small brass key from the cookie jar waited. "Yes." "Don't use it until I give you the signal," Dr. Reed said, then walked away without explanation. The lake house was a rustic cabin on the northern shore, surrounded by pine trees and offering a view of the water. By the time Greg arrived, about 20 people had gathered. Some he recognized from town, others were strangers. They moved around him in a quiet dance of grief, offering condolences, sharing more stories about Lydia. Beth handed him a glass of lemonade. "Your sister loved this place. Said it was the only spot where she could really think." Greg looked out at the lake shimmering in the late afternoon sun. "We used to come here as kids. Our grandparents owned it back then." "I know. Lydia bought it 2 years ago when it came up for sale. Said it was meant to be. Another piece of his sister's life Greg hadn't known about. I didn't realize she had that kind of money." Beth's expression shifted slightly. The medical foundation work paid well, and she lived simply, but something in her tone made Greg wonder if there was more to it. As the gathering continued, Greg found himself drawn to the window that faced the lake. In the distance, he could see the old boathouse, its weathered boards nearly the same gray as the water. What waited for him there? He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Dr. Reed until the older man was beside him. "It's time, Doctor," Reed said quietly. "Follow me, but not too closely. We don't want to draw attention." Puzzled, Greg waited as the doctor made his way toward the back door. After a few moments, he followed, slipping outside while the other guests were distracted by Beth bringing out a photo album. Dr. Reed was already halfway down the path that led to the boathouse. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, fallen pine needles forming a slippery carpet beneath their feet. The boathouse stood at the water's edge, a simple structure that had weathered countless storms. A small dock extended into the lake, empty now of the rowboat that had been kept there in Greg's childhood. Dr. Reed waited by the door, glancing back toward the lake house. "Do you have the key?" Greg produced it from his pocket. "Before we go in, Doctor," Reed said, his voice grave, "you need to understand something. What Lydia did, she did to protect people, to protect this town. There may be things inside that are difficult to accept, but you must trust that your sister had her reasons." A cold feeling settled in Greg's stomach. "What exactly am I going to find in there, Doctor?" The old man's eyes were sad. "The truth about why Lydia wanted a closed casket, and why what's buried in her grave isn't what everyone thinks." Greg's hand trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the rusty lock. It turned with surprising ease, as if it had been recently oiled. The door swung open on silent hinges. Inside, the boathouse was dim, light filtering through dusty windows. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Fishing gear hanging on walls, life preservers stacked in a corner, the smell of lake water and old wood. But then Greg saw it. A modern filing cabinet against the back wall, looking bizarrely out of place among the rustic surroundings. Beside it stood a small desk with a laptop computer. This was Lydia's real office, Dr. Reed explained, where she could work without being observed. "Work on what?" Greg asked, moving toward the desk. Dr. Reed sighed heavily. "Proving that Pine Creek is being poisoned." On the desk lay a leather-bound journal, Lydia's handwriting on the open page. Greg scanned the words, his confusion growing. Water samples, contamination levels, children's blood tests. He looked up at Dr. Reed. "I don't understand." 2 years ago, Lydia noticed an unusual number of children in town developing similar symptoms: headaches, rashes, respiratory problems. As a librarian, she was in a unique position to see patterns that others might miss. Greg remembered Danny, the boy from the funeral, mentioning water testing. She was investigating? Dr. Reed nodded. She came to me with her concerns. I ran tests on some of the children. With their parents' permission, the results were troubling. Greg flipped through more pages of the journal. These are coordinates, locations around town. Places where she collected samples. The highest concentrations were found upstream from the old mill site, where Richardson Development has been preparing for their new housing project. The name rang a bell. The development project she fought against? Publicly, she opposed it on historical preservation grounds. But her real concern was that they were disturbing soil contaminated decades ago by the mill's chemical waste. Greg continued scanning the journal, turning pages until he came to one that made his blood run cold. It contained a list of threats, phone calls, vandalized property, warnings to stop digging or else. She was being threatened? Why didn't she go to the police? Dr. Reed's laugh was bitter. Chief Patterson's brother-in-law is the lead investor in Richardson Development. Besides, they were careful, nothing that could be proven. Greg felt anger rising in him. So what does this have to do with her funeral? With the closed casket? Dr. Reed moved to the filing cabinet and pulled out a drawer. Because of this. Inside were dozens of sealed evidence bags containing soil samples, water vials, and what appeared to be medical reports. Evidence? Greg asked. Evidence that would be destroyed if Richardson knew about it. Evidence that might have died with Lydia. Dr. Reed met Greg's eyes. Evidence that is now supposedly buried in your sister's grave. Greg stared at the doctor, understanding finally dawning. There's nothing in that casket, is there? Just this stuff? Dr. Reed nodded. It was Lydia's idea. Her final move in a game she knew she might not live to finish. Then where is she? Where's my sister's body? The doctor's expression was gentle but firm. That, Greg, is what we need to discuss next. Greg sank onto the small wooden stool by the desk, his legs suddenly unable to support him. What do you mean, where is my sister's body? Are you saying she's not dead? Dr. Reed's face showed a flicker of pain. No, I'm afraid Lydia is truly gone. But she's not in that grave. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the boathouse windows. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted from the lake house where people were sharing memories of a woman whose final secret was unfolding in this dusty space. I don't understand, Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Reed pulled another stool close and sat facing Greg. For a moment, he looked every one of his 70-plus years. Your sister was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer 18 months ago. By the time we caught it, there wasn't much we could do except manage her pain. The doctor's clinical tone couldn't quite mask his sorrow. But Lydia being Lydia, she was determined that her death would have meaning. Greg thought of the journal, the water samples, the evidence hidden in plain sight in a casket buried under 6 feet of earth. The contamination investigation. Yes. She knew she was running out of time and Richardson Development was moving forward with their plans. If they broke ground before anyone could prove the soil was toxic, more children would get sick. But why fake her burial? Why not just leave all this evidence with someone? With you? Dr. Reed shook his head. There had already been a break-in at my office. Nothing obvious was taken, but Lydia's file had been rifled through, and Beth found her desk at the library searched one morning. Whoever was behind this was getting desperate. Greg ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. So where is she? Where did they take my sister's body? That's where it gets complicated. Dr. Reed stood and moved to a tarp-covered shape in the corner of the boathouse that Greg had assumed was just stored equipment. The doctor pulled back the tarp to reveal a small freezer. Greg's stomach dropped. Please tell me my sister isn't in there. Dr. Reed actually smiled slightly. No, nothing so dramatic, just more samples that need to be kept cold. Tissue samples from affected children, taken with parental consent, of course. Blood work. Evidence that builds the case. Then, where is she? Lydia donated her body to science, specifically to a medical research facility studying the same rare cancer that took her life. She was transported there the day before you arrived in town. Greg felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Even Lydia's body was gone now, given away to strangers in her final act of generosity. She wanted to tell you herself. Dr. Reed continued. Had this whole plan to reach out when the time came, but the disease progressed faster than expected at the end. By the time she asked me to call you, she could barely speak. Greg thought of all the missed opportunities, the wasted years of silence between them. What were her last words? Dr. Reed's eyes grew distant with memory. She said, "Tell Greg I forgave him long ago. Now he needs to finish what I started." A lump formed in Greg's throat. Even at the end, his sister had been thinking of others, of the town, of the sick children, of him and his guilt. Finish what? I'm not a scientist or an investigator. I'm a graphic designer from the city. What am I supposed to do with all this? He gestured at the evidence, the journal, the years of his sister's work. You're her brother, Dr. Reed said simply. The only person she trusted completely to do the right thing once you knew the truth. And you have one advantage Lydia never had. What's that? You're an outsider. No one here has leverage over you. No one can threaten your job or your standing in the community. Greg wasn't convinced. These people threatened my sister. What's to stop them from threatening me? The fact that if anything happens to you now, after Lydia's convenient death, it would raise too many questions. Dr. Reed tapped the filing cabinet. Besides, you have insurance. Insurance? Lydia made copies, digital copies of everything, stored on encrypted drives. If anything happens to you, those files go to the State Environmental Agency, the CDC, and 3 major newspapers. Greg couldn't help but be impressed by his sister's thoroughness. She'd thought of everything, except surviving to see justice done herself. A noise outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on the wooden dock. Dr. Reed quickly pulled the tarp back over the freezer and moved to the door, peering through a crack. He relaxed visibly. It's just Beth. He opened the door to let her in. Beth's eyes were red from crying, but there was a determined set to her jaw. People are starting to leave, she said. I thought you should know before someone comes looking for either of you. Thank you, Dr. Reed said. Beth looked at Greg, then at the open journal and filing cabinet. So he knows? Most of it, Dr. Reed confirmed. Greg looked between them. You were helping her too? Beth nodded. My son was one of the first kids to get sick. Rashes that wouldn't heal, nosebleeds, headaches so bad he'd cry for hours. Doctors couldn't figure it out until Lydia started connecting the dots. Danny, Greg guessed, remembering the boy from the funeral. You met him. Beth seemed surprised. Briefly, he mentioned something about being secret scientists. Beth's smile was sad. That was Lydia's way of making the water testing seem like an adventure instead of something scary. She was good with kids like that. The 3 stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of Lydia's final mission. What happens now? Greg finally asked. Dr. Reed and Beth exchanged looks. That depends on you, Beth said. How much of your sister's fight are you willing to take on? It was a fair question. Greg had spent 15 years running from family responsibilities. Now his sister was asking him, from beyond the grave, to pick up a burden she'd carried, alone. I need to think, he said. Of course, Dr. Reed nodded. But don't think too long. Richardson Development breaks ground in 2 weeks. Back at Lydia's house, Greg sat in the growing darkness, turning the day's revelations over in his mind. On the kitchen table lay Lydia's journal, which Dr. Reed had insisted he take with him. Read it, the doctor had urged. All of it. Understand what you're fighting for before you decide whether to fight. So Greg read, as night settled over Pine Creek. He read about his sister's first suspicions, her careful documentation of children's illnesses plotted against where they lived and played. He read about water samples taken under cover of darkness, about meetings with concerned parents who were afraid to speak publicly, and he read about the threats, phone calls in the middle of the night, a dead bird left on her porch, Brake. Lines on her car mysteriously cut. Through it all, Lydia's handwriting remained steady, her resolve unwavering. Toward the end, as her health failed, the entries grew shorter but more urgent. The final page contained a list of names. People. She trusted people who could help. Greg's name was at the top, circled twice. She had never stopped believing in him, even when he'd given her every reason to. A sharp knock at the door startled him from his reading. It was late for visitors, nearly midnight. Cautiously, Greg approached the door and peered through the peephole. A man in a police uniform stood on the porch, face half hidden by the brim of his hat. Greg opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" "Officer Wilson, Pine Creek PD," the man said, flashing a badge. "Sorry to disturb you so late, but I need to ask you a few questions about your sister." Greg's instincts hummed with warning. Dr. Reed had mentioned the police chief's connection to Richardson Development. Was this a trap? "It's been a long day," Greg said. "Could this wait until morning?" Officer Wilson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid not. It's come to our attention that your sister may have been involved in some irregular activities before her death. We just need to clear a few things up." Greg's mind raced. What? Did they know? Had someone seen him and Dr. Reed at the boathouse? Did they somehow know about the empty casket? "What kind of activities?" he asked, playing for time. "Trespassing on private property. Possible theft of soil samples from the old mill site. Nothing major, but we need to close the file now that she's passed." Greg leaned against the doorframe, blocking the officer's view into the house and, importantly, of the journal on the kitchen table. "I don't know anything about that," he said truthfully. "I hadn't spoken to my sister in years." "So I've heard." Officer Wilson's tone was neutral, but his eyes were calculating. "Mind if I come in? Just a few questions, then I'll be on my way." Every instinct told Greg not to let this man into the house. "Actually, I do mind. Like I said, it's been a long day. I buried my sister this morning." Something hardened in Officer Wilson's face. "Mr. Winters, I understand you're grieving, but this is an official police matter." Greg stood his ground. "And I'll be happy to help tomorrow at the station, with my lawyer present." "Lawyer?" Officer Wilson raised an eyebrow. "That seems excessive for a few simple questions." "Does it?" "Because showing up at midnight to interrogate a grieving family member seems excessive to me." They stared at each other for a long moment before Officer Wilson finally stepped back. "Tomorrow, then. 9 a.m. at the station." He turned to go, then paused. "By the way, if you happen to find any of your sister's research materials, we'd appreciate you turning those over for the investigation." "What investigation would that be exactly?" Greg asked. Officer Wilson's smile was cold. "Like I said, 9 a.m. After the police car pulled away, Greg closed and locked the door, his heart pounding. They knew something. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to be worried about what Lydia might have left behind. He returned to the kitchen and gathered up the journal and his sister's letter. Whatever decision he made, he couldn't make it here. The house wasn't safe. As he stuffed the materials into his duffel bag, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Don't go to police station tomorrow. Meet at Westside Diner 8 a.m. Bring everything, come alone." Be Beth. It had to be. But could he trust her? Could he trust anyone in this town? One thing was certain. He couldn't run away this time. Not when his sister had trusted him with her life's final work. Not when children like Danny were still getting sick. Greg zipped up his bag and turned off the lights. He wouldn't be sleeping at Lydia's house tonight. Whether he liked it or not, he was now part of his sister's secret war, and the enemy already knew he was here. Greg spent the night at a small motel on the edge of town, paying cash and using a fake name. It wasn't something he'd ever done before, and he felt ridiculous doing it, like a character in one of those thriller movies Lydia used to love. But after Officer Wilson's midnight visit, he wasn't taking any chances. He barely slept, reading through more of Lydia's journal instead. Around dawn, he found something that made his breath catch. A list of names with a heading that simply read, "The Affected." 23 children, ages 4 to 12, all with similar symptoms. Next to each name was a series of numbers that Greg eventually realized were coordinates, locations where each child lived or went to school. When he plotted these points on a map of Pine Creek using his phone, a pattern emerged. All the affected children lived or spent significant time downwind or downstream from the old mill site. By the time Greg walked into the West Side Diner at 7:55 the next morning, his eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, but his mind was clear. He'd made his decision. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an elderly couple in a booth by the window. No sign of Beth. Greg chose a seat with his back to the wall, where he could see both the entrance and the back door. At exactly 8 o'clock, his phone buzzed with another text. "Order coffee, wait." Greg did as instructed, fighting the urge to look around for hidden observers. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, brought his coffee with a sympathetic smile. "You're Lydia's brother, aren't you? I recognize you from her photos." When Greg nodded, she added, "I'm real sorry about your loss. She was one of the good ones." "Thank you," Greg said, surprised by how much the simple kindness affected him. She used to come in here most mornings, always had her nose in some book or scribbling in that journal of hers. The waitress glanced toward the back of the diner. Booth in the corner was her favorite. Greg followed her gaze to an empty booth. "Mind if I move over there?" "Help yourself, honey. I'll bring your coffee." As Greg settled into his sister's regular spot, he noticed something carved into the wooden tabletop, partially hidden by the napkin dispenser. 2 small letters. L.W. Lydia Winters. The bell over the door jingled, and Greg looked up to see Dr. Reed enter, followed by Beth and, to his surprise, Danny. The boy's presence made Greg uneasy. Whatever was about to happen, was it safe to involve a child? The 3 slid into the booth, Danny next to Greg, the adults opposite. "I hope you don't mind that Danny's here," Beth said, noticing Greg's expression. "He's part of this, too. I'm Lydia's research assistant," the boy explained with a seriousness that would have been comical under different circumstances. "I know all the collection spots." "We don't have much time," Dr. Reed said in a low voice. "Officer Wilson has been asking questions all over town. He stopped by my office first thing this morning." "What did he want?" Greg asked. "To know if Lydia had left any papers with me. Said it was for an ongoing investigation. He came to our house too," Danny piped up. "Asked Mom if Miss Lydia ever gave her anything to keep safe." Beth nodded, grimly. "They're looking for the evidence. They must have figured out it wasn't buried with her." Greg's stomach tightened. How could they know that? Dr. Reed and Beth exchanged looks. "There's someone else involved," the doctor said finally. "Someone Lydia trusted, who might have talked." "Who?" "The funeral director, Joe Sullivan," Beth said. "He helped with the special arrangements. He's the only one besides us who knew the casket didn't contain Lydia's body." Greg remembered the funeral director, a solemn man with kind eyes who had seemed genuinely sorrowful about Lydia's passing. Why would he talk? "His brother works for Richardson Development," Dr. Reed explained, "and their mother is in a nursing home that costs more than Joe can afford on a funeral director's salary." "They got to him," Greg concluded. "We think so, but we can't be sure." Greg took a moment to process this. So if they know the evidence wasn't buried with Lydia, they'll be looking for it elsewhere. "The boathouse is clean," Beth assured him. "We moved everything last night after you left. It's all in a safe place now." "Where? The less you know." "Right now, the better," Dr. Reed said. "What's important is what we do next." "I've been thinking about that," Greg said. He pulled out his phone and showed them the map he'd created with the affected children's locations. "There's a clear pattern here. Every sick child is connected to the old mill site area. We need more than just Lydia's samples. We need official testing." "We've tried," Beth said, frustration evident in her voice. "The town council blocked. It said it would create unnecessary panic and hurt property values." "Then we go above them," Greg said. "State Environmental Agency." "Already tried that too," Dr. Reed sighed. "They sent someone out, but Richardson has friends in the state capitol. The inspector barely looked around before declaring everything. Fine. Greg felt his newfound determination wavering. So what can we do? Danny, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. We need to make everyone see. Like really see. The adults all looked at him. What do you mean, buddy? Greg asked. Show, don't tell. That's what Miss Lydia always said. Danny pulled a small notebook from his pocket, a miniature version of Lydia's journal. We did an experiment once, took water from the creek near the mill and put white flowers in it. They turned yellow-brown in 2 days. Beth looked startled. You never told me about that experiment. Miss Lydia said it was our secret scientist work. Danny flipped pages in his notebook until he found what he was looking for. See? We took pictures. The photos showed a simple science experiment. White carnations in jars of water. The flowers in regular tap water remained white, while those in water from the creek had developed sickly yellow-brown streaks. Visual evidence, Dr. Reed murmured. Simple enough that anyone can understand it. But bigger, Danny insisted, so everyone can see. Greg felt something stirring in his mind, the beginnings of an idea. The town festival, it's next weekend, right? Beth nodded. Founders Day, big celebration in the town square. Everyone attends, including Richardson and his investors, Dr. Reed added. They always make a big show of their community support. Perfect, Greg said. We'll make our own show. For the next hour, they huddled in Lydia's booth, developing a plan. They would create a public demonstration of the contamination, something too visible to be ignored or covered up. Dr. Reed would compile medical records showing the pattern of illness. Beth would rally other parents of affected children. Danny would help recreate his flower experiment on a larger scale. And Greg would do what he did best, design a visual presentation that would make the evidence undeniable. What about Officer Wilson and the police? Beth asked. They're not going to just let us do this. That's why we need a distraction, Greg said. Something to keep them busy while we set up. I might be able to help with that, Dr. Reed said, thoughtfully. I have a few friends at the hospital who owe me favors. As they finalized details, Greg felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was madness. He was plotting what amounted to a public protest against the most powerful people in town, based on evidence hidden in his dead sister's fake grave. Yet somehow it felt right. For the first time in 15 years, he was standing with his sister instead of running from her. They were about to leave when the diner's door swung open, and Officer Wilson walked in. The group froze as his eyes scanned the room and locked onto their booth. Mr. Winters, he said, approaching with a cold smile. Funny running into you here. I thought we had an appointment at the station at 9. Is it 9 already? Greg said, feigning surprise. I must have lost track of time catching up with old friends. Officer Wilson's gaze slid over Dr. Reed, Beth, and Danny. Quite the gathering, almost like a committee meeting. Just sharing memories of Lydia, Beth said smoothly. She meant a lot to all of us. I'm sure, Wilson said, clearly not believing a word. Well, since I've found you, perhaps we could have our chat now, down at the station. Greg felt the others tense beside him. Going to the police station was the last thing he wanted, but refusing would only make Wilson more suspicious. Before he could answer, his phone rang. The screen showed unknown caller. Excuse me, Greg said, answering the call. A woman's voice, unfamiliar and urgent, came through. Mr. Winters, this is Nurse Patel from Pine Creek Medical Center. There's been a situation with your sister's arrangements. We need you to come immediately. Greg knew there was no situation. Lydia's body wasn't even at the local medical center. This had to be the distraction Dr. Reed had mentioned, implemented more quickly than expected. I'll be right there, he said, then looked up at Officer Wilson with what he hoped was a convincing expression of concern. I have to go. There's a problem at the medical center with my sister's arrangements. Wilson looked skeptical. What kind of problem? I don't know yet, but since it involves my sister, I need to handle it. I'll drive you, Wilson offered, though it wasn't really an offer. That's not necessary. I insist. Wilson's hand moved subtly toward his belt, a reminder of his authority. "We can talk on the way." Greg looked desperately at Dr. Reed, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. The message was clear. "Go along with it for now." "Fine," Greg said, standing. "Let's go." As Wilson led him out to the police cruiser, Greg glanced back at the booth. Beth was already on her phone, presumably warning whoever was waiting at the medical center. Danny was scribbling furiously in his notebook, and Dr. Reed was watching, Greg with an expression that somehow conveyed both worry and confidence. The plan had hit its first obstacle, but they were committed now. In less than a week, they would expose the truth about what was poisoning Pine Creek, or they would fail, and whatever was buried in Lydia's tomb would stay buried forever. In the police car, Officer Wilson was silent for the first few minutes of the drive. Then, without looking at Greg, he said, "You know, your sister was well liked in this town, respected. But she had some misguided ideas toward the end." "What kind of ideas?" Greg asked carefully. "She got it into her head that the mill site was dangerous, started spreading rumors making people worried for no reason." Wilson glanced at him. "The thing is, Mr. Winters, those kinds of rumors can hurt a town like Pine Creek, scare away investors, cost jobs. Is that more important than children's health?" Wilson's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "There's nothing wrong with those kids that isn't happening everywhere else in the country. Allergies, asthma, it's modern life. 23 cases in a town this size isn't normal," Greg said, then immediately regretted revealing what he knew. Wilson's eyes narrowed. "So you have been looking at her research?" The medical center came into view ahead, saving Greg from having to answer. As they pulled into the parking lot, he spotted a flurry of activity at the emergency entrance. Ambulances, medical staff rushing around, what appeared to be a crisis in progress. "What the hell?" Wilson muttered, parking haphazardly. A harried-looking nurse approached as they got out of the car. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. We've got multiple patients coming in with food poisoning symptoms from the senior center. Breakfast. We need help managing the crowd." Wilson hesitated, torn between his duty as a police officer and his mission to intimidate Greg. "You should go," Greg suggested. "I can find my own way to sort out this issue with my sister." After a moment of internal struggle, Wilson nodded curtly. "This isn't over, Winters. We'll continue our conversation later." As the officer hurried toward the emergency entrance, Greg felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find a young woman in scrubs. "Mr. Winters? I'm Nurse Patel." Dr. Reed called ahead. "Come with me quickly, before Officer Wilson realizes there's no problem with your sister's arrangements." Greg followed her through a side entrance and down a maze of corridors until they reached a service exit on the opposite side of the building. "There's a car waiting to take you to the safe house," she explained, handing him a set of keys. "Silver, Honda, third row. The address is programmed into the GPS." "What about the food poisoning emergency?" Nurse Patel smiled slightly. "Minor issue with the senior center's breakfast. Nothing serious, mostly upset stomachs and worried seniors. But it should keep Officer Wilson occupied for a while." Greg felt a new appreciation for Dr. Reed's resources and planning. "Thank you for your help." "Don't thank me," she said. "Your sister helped my nephew when he was sick. I'm just returning the favor." As Greg drove away from the medical center, following the GPS directions to whatever safe house awaited him, he realized that Lydia's true legacy wasn't what was buried in her tomb. It was the network of people she'd touched, the community she'd built, and the cause she'd given her life for. And now, it was his cause too. The safe house turned out to be a small cabin deep in the woods outside of town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that would have been easy to miss if not for the GPS. As Greg pulled up, he recognized Dr. Reed's car already parked in the clearing. Inside, he found not just the doctor, but Beth, Danny, and 3 other adults he didn't recognize. 2 women and a man, all with the same worried but determined expressions. "Greg, meet the rest of Lydia's team," Dr. Reed said. "Parents of affected children who've been working with your sister for months." The man stepped forward, extending his hand. "I'm Pete. My twins started getting nosebleeds last year. Doctors couldn't explain it until Lydia connected the dots." The women introduced themselves as Tina and Carol, both teachers at the elementary school who had noticed the pattern of illnesses among their students. "We've been gathering evidence for nearly a year," Tina explained. "Water samples, soil tests, medical records, all pointing to the same conclusion. The old mill site is leaching chemicals into the groundwater," Carol added. "And when Richardson started preliminary excavation work, they disturbed soil that had been containing the worst of it." Greg looked around at these ordinary people who had become unlikely environmental detectives. Why hasn't anyone outside town listened? This seems like something the national media would care about. Pete's laugh was bitter. "Richardson owns the local paper. And he's got friends in high places who make sure complaints don't get too far. 3 reporters from bigger papers have come to investigate. All 3 suddenly got reassigned to different stories before they could publish anything. But now we have something they didn't," Beth said, gesturing to several boxes stacked in the corner. "Physical evidence that can't be ignored and a plan to make it public." For the next 5 days, the cabin became command central for their operation. Greg used his design skills to create compelling visual displays showing the pattern of contamination and illness. Danny and the other children of the group built dozens of his flower experiment setups. Dr. Reed compiled medical files, with names, removed for privacy, showing the unusual pattern of symptoms. They worked in shifts, always keeping watch for unexpected visitors. Officer Wilson had been asking about Greg all over town, but so far the cabin remained undiscovered. On the night before Founders' Day, they gathered for a final review of the plan. "Everything is ready at the square," Pete reported. "The booth is reserved under the elementary school science fair banner. No one will question us setting up early. The medical files and water test results are prepared," Dr. Reed added, "all documented and verified by colleagues outside Pine Creek who can't be pressured by Richardson. And I've contacted every parent of an affected child," Beth said. 36 families have agreed to stand with us tomorrow. That's 13 more than Lydia had on her original list. Greg felt a mix of pride and anxiety. His sister's work had grown beyond what even she had known. But tomorrow would be dangerous. They were directly challenging the most powerful people in town, people who had already shown they weren't above threats and intimidation. "What about Richardson?" he asked. "He'll try to shut us down the minute he realizes what we're doing. That's where timing is crucial," Dr. Reed explained. "The festival officially opens at noon, with Richardson giving his annual speech at 12:30. We'll set up our display but keep it covered until exactly 12:15, when most people will already be gathered for the speech. By the time Richardson realizes what's happening, the whole town will be seeing our evidence," Beth added. "And we've invited a reporter from the state newspaper, one who owes me a favor and won't be easily scared off." As the others continued discussing last-minute details, Greg stepped outside for some air. The night was clear, stars bright in the darkness above the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. He thought about Lydia, about the path that had led him here. If someone had told him 2 weeks ago that he'd be leading a public environmental protest in his hometown, he would have laughed. He'd spent 15 years building a life as far from Pine Creek as possible. Yet here he was, standing in his sister's shoes, continuing her fight. And somehow, it felt right. Like he was finally doing what he should have done years ago. Standing beside her instead of running away. The cabin door opened behind him and Danny stepped out. "Can't sleep?" Greg asked. The boy shook his head. "Too excited. And kinda scared." "Me too," Greg admitted. Danny looked up at the stars. "Miss Lydia used to say that being scared just means you're about to do something important." Greg smiled. "That sounds like her. Do you think she knows what we're doing?" It was the kind of question adults often dismissed with platitudes, but Greg found himself giving it serious consideration. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I like to think she does." Danny nodded, satisfied with the answer. "Tomorrow's going to work, I can feel it." Greg hoped the boy was right. Founders' Day dawned bright and clear, Perfect festival weather. By 9 o'clock, the town square was bustling with activity as vendors set up booths and volunteers hung decorations. In the center of it all, a stage had been erected for the day's speeches and performances. Greg and his team arrived early as planned to set up their booth. Labeled as the Pine Creek Elementary Science Showcase, it drew no special attention as they arranged tables and hung charts still covered with cloths. By 11:30, the square was filled with townspeople enjoying the festivities. Children ran with balloons and cotton candy. Local bands played on a small side stage. The mood was celebratory and relaxed. Greg, positioned near their booth, spotted Richardson arriving with an entourage of suited men and women, business, partners, and investors most likely. The developer moved through the crowd like a minor celebrity, shaking hands and posing for photos. At a distance, Officer Wilson stood watching, his eyes occasionally scanning the crowd. Once his gaze passed over Greg, who quickly turned away. 15 minutes, Beth murmured, appearing at his side. Everyone's in position. Around the square, Greg could see their allies. Dr. Reed near the stage, Pete by the main entrance, the parents of affected children strategically placed throughout the crowd. Each wore a small blue ribbon pinned to their shirt, Lydia's favorite color, their secret signal. At precisely 12:15, as Richardson was preparing to take the stage, Beth gave the signal, a simple nod to those nearby, who passed it on to others. In perfect coordination, the covers came off their displays. Parents stepped forward with their children, and Dr. Reed approached the stage with a portable microphone. Before today's festivities continue, he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieting crowd, there's something the people of Pine Creek need to know. Richardson, halfway up the stage steps, turned in confusion. For the past 2 years, Dr. Reed continued, children in our town have been getting sick, not with ordinary childhood illnesses, but with symptoms consistent with toxic exposure. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people began moving toward the displays Greg had created, maps showing the pattern of illness, charts documenting the timeline, and most dramatic of all, Danny's flower experiment replicated dozens of times with water from different parts of town. White flowers in clean water remained white. Flowers in water from near the mill site had turned sickly yellow-brown. The cause of this illness, Dr. Reed went on, is contamination from the old mill site, toxic chemicals that have leached into our groundwater for decades, now being released into our air and water as the soil is disturbed by new development. Richardson had recovered from his surprise and was storming toward Dr. Reed. This is ridiculous. Stop this fear-mongering immediately. But it was too late. People were already gathered around the displays. Parents of sick children were speaking out, and the reporter Beth had invited was taking photographs. Officer Wilson pushed through the crowd, heading toward Greg. You're under arrest for disturbing the peace and public endangerment. On what grounds? Greg challenged, loud enough for those nearby to hear. You're causing a panic with unsubstantiated claims, Wilson said, reaching for his handcuffs. Unsubstantiated? A new voice joined the confrontation, a woman Greg didn't recognize. I think not. She held up an ID badge. Agent Linda Mercer, Environmental Protection Agency. We've been conducting our own investigation for the past month, prompted by anonymous tips and evidence. Wilson froze, handcuffs still in hand. Evidence? Richardson had arrived, face flushed with anger. What evidence? Soil and water samples, Agent Mercer replied coolly. Medical reports, and most interestingly, a complete set of documentation that was delivered to our office 1 week ago. Greg felt a chill run down his spine. 1 week ago, the day of Lydia's funeral, the day her empty casket was buried. The evidence wasn't in the casket, he realized aloud. That was a decoy. You sent the real evidence directly to the EPA. Dr. Reed, who had joined them, nodded slightly. Your sister didn't trust that the evidence would remain safe here, even hidden. She arranged for everything to be sent out the day of her funeral. Richardson's face had gone from red to pale. This is absurd. I've had the site tested repeatedly. It's perfectly safe. By testers you paid for, Beth countered. Our independent tests show different results. Agent Mercer gestured to several official-looking people who had been scattered through the crowd, now converging on their position. "We have a court order to halt all development at the mill site pending a complete environmental assessment, and we'll be investigating how previous complaints about this matter were handled." At this, Officer Wilson quietly put away his handcuffs and began backing away. The crowd had grown larger, people pushing forward to hear the confrontation. Some looked confused, others angry, many simply concerned. An older man pushed to the front. "I worked at that mill for 30 years. We always knew they buried chemicals on the property. Company told us it was safe, but none of us would grow vegetables in our gardens downwind of that place." Others began to speak up, sharing suspicions they'd had, symptoms their children had shown, concerns that had been dismissed. In the midst of the growing chorus of voices, Greg felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Danny. "Look," the boy said, pointing to the edge of the crowd. There stood Joe Sullivan, the funeral director, watching the scene unfold with tears in his eyes. When he saw Greg looking at him, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning to walk away. Later, after the EPA had secured the mill site and Richardson had been taken in for questioning, Greg and the others gathered at the lake house. The mood was subdued but hopeful. Their public stand had worked, but there was still a long road ahead. "What happens now?" Greg asked Dr. Reed. "Tests, investigations, probably lawsuits," the doctor replied. "The truth is out, but making things right will take time." "Will the children get better?" Beth, overhearing, joined them. "Some already are, just from being kept away from the contaminated areas. Others may need more time and treatment, but now they'll get the help they need." Greg looked out at the lake, thinking of his sister. "And Lydia? Will people know what she did?" "They already do," Dr. Reed said, gesturing to where Danny was showing other children Lydia's journal, explaining her work with obvious pride. "Her story is being told. The truth is no longer buried." 1 year later, Greg stood before a simple stone in the Pine Creek Cemetery. It wasn't Lydia's original grave. That had been opened, the evidence removed, the empty casket reburied elsewhere. This was a new memorial, placed on a sunny hillside overlooking the lake she had loved. The inscription read, "Lydia Winters, beloved sister, friend, and protector of Pine Creek." Greg placed a bouquet of white flowers at the base of the stone. "Did it, sis," he said softly. "Richardson Development is bankrupt from the lawsuits. The mill site is being properly cleaned up. The children are getting better." He paused, feeling the weight of the past year. The investigations, the testimonies, the slow but steady progress toward justice and healing. "I'm staying, by the way. Took a job teaching art at the high school. Turns out I don't hate this town after all." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and for a moment, Greg could almost imagine his sister's voice on the wind, not saying anything specific, just the familiar cadence of her laugh. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small figure sitting on a bench nearby. Danny, waiting patiently with a notebook in hand. "Ready for our water testing?" the boy asked, holding up the book. "I've got 5 new locations mapped out," Greg smiled. "Lead the way, research assistant." Together they walked down the path, continuing the work Lydia had begun, not because they had to, but because now they understood what she had always known, that some truths should never stay buried, and that fighting for those truths was worth any sacrifice. Behind them, in the quiet cemetery, white flowers brightened Lydia's memorial stone, not brown, not wilted, but pure and healthy in the clear air of a town finally beginning to heal.